So, Mark, great news about Word in Your Park on June the 3rd. We've already announced we've got Bob Stanley talking about the Bee Gees. We've got Leslie Ann Jones talking about the Rolling Stones. We've got John Higgs talking about the Beatles and James Bond. And now tell everybody who we've got, Mark.
This is very exciting. We've got our old pal, Claire Grogan. She of Altered Images, who's going to talk about, well, essentially 40 years of being Claire Grogan, but so many good parts of the story, aren't there? She's tell the story about how she got the job on Gregory's Girl.
Yes.
Which is working in a spaghetti restaurant as a waitress or whatever.
At the age of 18, I think.
Age of 18. She'd talk about just the whole pop circus of the 1980s, which is just riveting. The time we were at Smash Hits, it's just a glorious era. And what else did you do? She was on Red Dwarf, wasn't she?
Absolutely.
She once told the story about going to Red Dwarf conventions, sitting there signing photographs of the kind of people who came. It was really interesting and funny and very affectionate, wasn't it?
She's always interesting, she's always funny, and she's going to be one of our guests at Word in Your Park on June the 3rd this year. This takes place at Opera Holland Park. We went down there this week just to have a look at it. They're building the fabulous covered amphitheatre. What are you calling it? An auditorium, a covered auditorium.
An auditorium.
So it's a perfect combination. It lets the sunshine in, but strangely enough, it keeps the rain out. And we were in a position also to inspect the luxury toilets, which are being installed, if anybody's bothered about that kind of thing. Bars, all the comforts of home and more takes place on June the 3rd, Holland Park. Claire Grogan, John Higgs, Bob Stanley, and Leslie Ann Jones. Be there. Tickets below.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
We're recording this the day after the sad news about Barry Humphries, a.k.a. Dame Edna, a.k.a. Celeste Patterson. And what a man. It was so lovely seeing all those old clips on the telly last night. He was really good, wasn't he?
Well, he's been a part of my life one way or another for almost as long as I can remember. I was trying to think about this. Because I must have seen him on telly in the 60s, in the early 60s, but I certainly was aware of him as the guy who wrote or invented the strip in Private Eye, The Adventures of Barry Mackenzie. Do you remember this?
I do.
Kind of Aussie in Earl's Court, and introduced us to the strange kind of, frankly, vulgar vernacular, which we always associated with Australia ever since. When he talked about going to the lavatory, it was always straining the potatoes.
Siphon the python. That's right. And a chunder in the old Pacifico. He did. I mean, I think Australians must have been a bit fed up, really, of the damage he did to their cultural reputation, which took years for them to kind of.
But he made up a lot of that stuff, didn't he? He just completely invented it. It was in fantasy on the kind of on the basis of material that derived from Australia, I suppose. But he just embroidered it. And then there was
booze and sex, wasn't it? It was a wonderful thing. Sex is the most beautiful thing that can take place between a happily married man and his secretary. Do you remember that? He always said, I was born with the priceless gift, the ability to laugh at the misfortunes of others. It's just at the heart of most comedy, actually.
And then, of course, there was, the lady who was first of all known as Mrs. Edna Average, and then slowly kind of, he'd stroke of genius, and it took him quite a long time with Edna, was to present Edna as housewife superstar rather than being kind of a mousy individual that was rather disapproving. Suddenly he took to going on stage wearing sort of extraordinary kind of lurex gowns and so forth.
Outrageous pairs of glasses. Yeah.
And strewing gladdies all over the stalls. Yeah. And, from that derives so much of the humor, and it's really interesting to think with humorous people, how they will be remembered, because you and I, having grown up with Barry Humphries and his works, we've got all that stuff in our heads, haven't we? You know what I mean? But, when we go, it'll go as well. I don't know. It's interesting, when I think of the comic performers that I most love, people like Hancock, I've completely internalized all of Hancock. I know all the scripts. They're all in my head, you know.
But you don't feel that his reputation's being sustained, do you? Do you? I mean,
well, he is in my
kids got
mind.
No idea. Right?
No, absolutely. That's my point. Your kids have got no idea who he is, and your kids, well, probably know Barry Humphries, but you know, next generation probably won't. You know, which is a shame. You know, but do you remember at Smash Hits? I don't even remember this. Bev Hillier, who used to work at Smash Hits, she went to see the Dame in the West End in his pomp. In the 80s.
I did too.
When he did a show. Well, didn't he used to run a barbecue on stage and used to get people out of the audience to come and turn the sausages? And I think Bev was one of the people that he called out of the audience.
Fantastic.
What a wonderful memory that. They all had to wear kind of Dame Edna pinnies, you know.
Yes.
And help the Dane mount the barbecue.
He used to pick on people. I saw him once in some Soho theatre, must be in the early 90s. We'd always pick on people in the front row. So people were terrified of sitting there. One of his things, he's always gone on about clothes, you know. I remember him pointing to one woman and saying, I'm trying to find a word to describe the clothes you're wearing. Affordable. People would talk about their ambitions in life and things they want to do. He said, well, you've saved on clothes.
I was thinking, I remember a Dame Edna special, I don't know from how far this will go back, probably the 80s, where he was being, Dame Edna, the Dame, was being interviewed by Sue Lawley.
Oh, God, yes.
And she said, tell Sue, I can't do the voice at all. He said, you look as if you could do with something hot inside you.
I know, all those gags are mostly kind of sexual innuendo.
Absolutely. But the key thing is that the word hot. The way Dame Edna said hot with a slight choke in the back of the throat. It was absolutely amazing.
He did a brilliant routine once on Parkinson, I can remember, as Celeste Patterson, and he was talking about how his wife, I think the dog had hair in its ears or something, was there some kind of discomfort. So his wife was going to go and buy some hair remover. So she goes to the chemist to buy this hair remover, and the guy says, look, this is strong stuff. He said, if it's for your legs and arms, you know, don't leave it on for more than 10 minutes. You know, if it's for your face, you know, wash it with soap and water every 10 minutes, and you know, be very, very careful. She said, actually, it's for my schnauzer. You can see where this is going. He gives her a long look and says, well, don't ride a bike for a fortnight.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
So this week I went to the building in Great Marlborough Street near Oxford Circus, which was formerly the home to Marlborough Street Magistrates Court and is now a kind of chic hotel that has a preview theatre. And there to see a film about who is connected with Marlborough Street Magistrates Court.
Well, it's Brian Jones. I'm trying to remember why. Was he there on? Was he in the dock?
Well, I think Mick was in the dock there. I don't know if you have a dock in a magistrate's court. I don't know. No. But there's famous footage of Mick Jagger, and this is mid-60s, Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull and various members of the Rolling Stones appearing at Marlborough Street Magistrates Court. So it was considered an appropriate place to unveil Nick Broomfield's film documentary about Brian Jones, which is going to be shown on Arena on BBC in the coming weeks. And I'm always fascinated by Brian Jones. Do you know what mainly fascinates me about Brian Jones, Mark? Which, strangely enough,
it's the same as what fascinates me, which is the number of children he had. But go on.
Oh well, that's one thing.
Yeah.
Another thing that really fascinates me that I don't think gets sufficient serious critical notice in the whole Brian Jones story. And I happen to know, because I'm old enough to know that this was massively significant, is his hair. Yeah. His hair was the key thing about Brian Jones. Yeah. His hair was the key thing about the Rolling Stones. It was, whole careers have been based on Brian Jones's hair. The Byrds would not exist without Brian Jones's hair. Yeah? Michael Clarke was recruited into the Byrds because he had Brian Jones's hair. Yep. Nobody had Brian Jones's hair before Brian Jones. Since Brian Jones, loads of people have had Brian Jones's hair. You know, it popped up in the Stone Roses.
Tim Burgess of the Charlatans.
Absolutely. All these kind of people.
Stone Roses all had Brian Jones' hair.
I was sitting there in the preview theatre with Bobby Gillespie of Primal Scream. Brian Jones's hair. You know, for goodness sake. And of course, nobody ever really talks about it because that was the big problem about rock and roll and hair. There isn't an awful lot to say, but it's hugely significant. You know. Anyway, the thing that I want to just mention here is how amazing it is that Brian Jones never wrote a song, or never successfully wrote a song.
Which must have been the heart of a lot of his misery about the
absolutely.
Fact that it was his group. He'd formed the group. He was the kind of spiritual centre of the group, wasn't he? Cannonball Adderley, blues, R&B, all the things, like the heart and soul of what the Stones were about. And then suddenly he's usurped by the people who are A, taking control of the band, and B, making all the money.
Well, I obviously didn't realise that they were making all the money until a bit later. That's what tends to happen, isn't it? But it's very interesting that it was Andrew Oldham, who, don't forget, was only 19 or something at the time when he was handling their affairs, which is just an extraordinary thing. But he had already had some experience working with Brian Epstein and the Beatles. And so he knew that what really mattered was ownership of your material. And therefore, this group, who previously had only ever done Jimmy Reed tunes of Bo Diddley and Muddy Waters and all kinds of people like that, it was really important that they somehow generate their own material. And so he identified, it was him who said to Mick and Keith, you are the songwriting team. Now they used to tell a story about he locked us in a room and wouldn't let us come out until we'd written a song. And strangely enough, the song they wrote was Tell Me, which is on their only original tune on the first album. It's actually not a bad song at all, certainly for a first effort. But he identified those two who would write the songs. And, you know, that he must have seen something in them that was more than just musical. He must have thought, these guys will finish the job, you know, because any clown can start writing a song. It strikes me, it's like any kind of creative endeavor. What matters most is, can you finish it? Is, can you get it to the end? You know, can you get it from a few marks on a bit of paper to something that's identifiable like a picture? And obviously he thought that Mick and Keith could do that, and that somehow Brian couldn't.
Well, and there is proved right, wasn't he?
He was proved right. And there is a tape featured in the film of him trying to write a song with a guy who worked on Ready, Steady, Go. And it's just a reel-to-reel recording of him singing a bit of it. And then you can hear Brian goes, no. It just stops. You know, that's enough for that kind of thing. You know? And it's like he sort of couldn't face the embarrassment. Because if you're going to create anything, you have to be prepared to go through that period when it's not finished, when it looks a bit pathetic.
And you've got to stand it up. You've got to support it. You've got to believe in it. You've got to say to everybody, persevere, because I know in my head I can imagine what this is going to sound like.
Yeah.
Which he never could do. And also not a singer. So that's, you know, that's part of it, isn't it? You know, part of the whole process of being the integral member of the front line would be to be actually up there with the microphone.
And there is a bit where he's being interviewed on an American, there's quite a few clips of them in the early days being interviewed rather unsympathetically by the hosts of local TV shows in America and Australia, where, you know, they do that thing where they're singing on a stage, and at the end of the number, the kind of the presenter, who's generally a guy from local news, comes on with a microphone and sticks it in the face of the first person he comes to. And he goes, so how do you write your songs? And of course, he's pointing the microphone at Brian. And Brian has to say, well, I don't. And he looks really embarrassed.
Yeah.
And then the guy continues asking questions. Says, you really ought to speak to Mick and Keith about that. So the guy shuffles across and puts the microphone in front of Mick and Keith.
That's a terrible moment.
It's an awful moment.
That really is. That sums it up. That exposes everything. That's the story of the Rolling Stones at the 1968-69 there in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah. So yes, it's an interesting film, as he always is, as Nick Broomfield's films always are. And of course, Nick Broomfield also has the distinction of being able to say he met Brian Jones on a train.
How did you meet him?
He met him on a train. He was going back to school in the West Country, and there must have been a train on the way to Cheltenham or something. And Brian Jones happened to be on the train with him, and he struck up a conversation with him. And at that stage, Brian Jones was already a famous member of the Rolling Stones, but he had a chat with a 14-year-old schoolboy, which obviously made an impression on him. I'll tell you the other thing that's interesting that applies to documentaries about bands in the 60s and earlier, and that probably doesn't apply at all since, is that there are traces of letters. So, when people wrote fan mail to the Rolling Stones, they very often wrote it to Brian, and Brian very often replied. And so people keep the replies, and the replies seem to come. You look at this guy who was kind of rolling around, looking like the kind of pirate king of rock and roll,
yes,
Lord of all Surveyed. But when he sat down to write a letter, it was like Jennings and Derbyshire writing home from boarding school. Dear Jane, thank you very much for your letter
really
and the
formal
cake.
And polite.
Really formal. And
how
polite.
Funny, really well brought up. Yeah.
And because it's the same thing with the Beatles, isn't it? They wrote back to loads of fans, didn't they, in the early days? And it's the same thing.
Who obviously kept those letters, It would have
you would,
God, yeah.
But it's the fact that they sat down and got out a pen and wrote back to people at the height of Beatlemania or Rolling Stones being made.
Precisely.
It's absolutely extraordinary. Nobody would do it nowadays.
No. So Brian's kids, how many were there? Was it 5? Some sources say 6, don't they? But
I think it's certainly 5. Certainly 5.
All illegitimate kids. And I think he'd had 4 of them by the age of 19, was it, or 20?
And weren't quite a number of them called Julian.
Quite a number called Julian. There's one called Julian who was, by the girl who eventually, Linda Lawrence, who went on to marry Donovan.
Yeah.
So there's a start in life. You're Brian Jones's son and you're brought up by Donovan. My God.
Who puts the bins out?
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
I saw this tweet from Massive Attack in the light of the AI created music furore that's running. And the tweet says, this presumably comes from Massive Attack Central, from the Politburo of Massive Attack. Is the discussion, should AI recreate music? Or is the discussion, why is contemporary music so homogenized and formulaic that it's really easy to copy?
That's a really good point.
That's a really good
That's a brilliant point.
And because I was directed today to a YouTube page with a load of demonstrations of AI, do Kanye West in the style of The Weeknd or whatever, people demonstrating how to do this. And of course, I have to confess, it's completely lost on me because I'm not really clear what the original is supposed to sound like. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that's the way a lot of people will respond, that, is it the case that contemporary music sounds more alike than previous contemporary music? And if so, is that a direct consequence of the technology employed in making it? And is it also a consequence of the fact that most of it is made by committees? Because if you look at the writing credits on, a top 10 hit, it may be as many as 10 different people. Now, they haven't all sat in a room together with a blank sheet of paper, but some bits will have been provided by this person. Some bits will have been borrowed from an earlier record by this person and put together in that fashion. So they will have possibly less of a distinctive fingerprint than they might have had 40 years ago. Do you think there's anything in that?
There's certainly something in the idea that you might be using very similar structures, or in fact, the exact same structure that's been in another song. So that's something to do with it, I think. And also the fact that there are certain elements of pop songs that make them commercial, and those tend to be the things that, because they work, people then tend to do things in exactly the same style because it's a proven success. So there's probably slightly less of that sense of experiment, isn't there?
Yeah, and but it's also the other thing that's kind of inescapably bound up with this is just how much music there is nowadays.
Well, that I think is a big part of it because I really miss the old system, the old A&R system, really, because if you and I had a group in the 1970s, we'd have to compete against God knows how many others to get a record deal in the first place because we couldn't make a record without a record deal, without the money coming in. And that process cuts out a lot of groups who didn't deserve to, or somebody thought shouldn't have been making records. And then having got that deal, you've then got the A&R process of saying we only want 12 songs because recording was so expensive. So you're concentrating, you're whittling. There's an editing process, isn't there?
Yeah.
There's an editing process that just isn't there now, that you can just produce something and think, I'll try it out, and if it works, it works.
Because, the one thing we know, there's no doubt about this at all, that it's harder than ever to have any kind of success in music. No doubt about that at all. But, if you get success or top success in music, you can make a fortune. You can make more than you ever made before. But, to join that elect gets harder and harder. Now, this ought to be putting people off. But if you go and look on the streaming services or in any list of new releases, it's no indication that it's putting people off whatsoever. In fact, there are more. There are more than ever. More new stuff coming, and I go and look on the streaming services, and the first thing that kind of depresses me is that they have to sort the music into categories to have it, make any kind of sense to people. So if you're faced with a kind of menu of what there is, you first of all have to look at pop, rock, jazz, classical, electronic, soul, funk, R&B, metal, hip-hop, rap, blues, country, folk, soundtracks, world, reggae. And by the time you got to the end of the list, you think, I don't feel like it anymore, actually.
No. The moment's gone. Exactly.
It has.
Let's just slap this on and see what it's like.
Absolutely. Or let's go into a record shop and go, oh, that looks interesting because there's also a big display near the front or whatever.
It's giving you the opportunity to not be surprised by things because you're channeling it into stuff that you already like. And so that's disappointing.
But also, how meaningful can it possibly be? Do I already like pop rock? Do I already like electronic? It doesn't work like that, doesn't it? At all. You like certain things.
Nor do you think of it in those categories anyway. You just don't.
Now, the other thing about AI music is that, and I think you and Leslie wrote a thing about this week, that actually making a fuss about, AI records being produced in the style of Kanye West or, Drake or whoever, is kind of beside the point, really, because what do people want? They want, if they like Drake, they want Drake.
It's Drake that's the interesting thing, isn't it? See, I think that's interesting because whenever you listen to music, it's not like you're just listening to the music. You're not your head. There are two main associations. One is the people who make that music and your connection with them and their story. And the other is things that have happened in your life that you can associate with listening to that, to which it was a soundtrack. And those two things are a kind of human element, aren't they? Yeah. About yourself and about the people involved. Yeah. Which you're not going to get, presumably, from an AI recording.
So if somebody came along tomorrow and said, we got AI doing Radiohead or Bruce Springsteen. If you're a fan of Radiohead or Bruce Springsteen, do you consider that good news or bad news? I think you consider it bad news.
It's immensely bad news.
Because what you want is Bruce Springsteen done by Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan done by Bob Dylan, Bjork done by Bjork, not something that sounds like it that is generated by a machine,
I know that there's a Oasis AI, isn't there? AISIS, indeed. And that Liam Gallagher has made a great point of saying how much he applauds it and thinks it's fantastic, which is so typical of him, because he can't possibly feel that way, but he's just doing it because, he just wants to kind of, create a ripple, doesn't he? It's exactly the opposite of what people would expect him to say.
The word podcast. Clearly, there is no plan.
I don't know why I was thinking about this week, but the kind of polar opposite of the present day glut of music, of recorded music, and the kind of AI controversy is I was thinking back to, I think the year 1972, and my father had a small business, which had a small warehouse, and he had 4 people working for him. And at one stage, he did his back in, and I was at college or whatever, I'd just finished it. And so he needed me to go home for the summer and kind of look after the place because he couldn't work for a few weeks. So I found myself working in a warehouse in Yorkshire during the summer. During the summer, the Take It Easy by the Eagles came out. And
was that permanently on the radio again?
No. This is my point.
Oh, right.
I heard it once. I thought, I really like that. And then, as was the way things worked back in 1972, when there was probably only one radio station that ever played a pop record, and that was Radio 1, which was probably partly shared with Radio 2 part of the day, I think, so there was no capital radio, there was no independent commercial stations, and so forth. There was Radio 1. And so you thought, I want to hear that record again. And so I would be in this warehouse, and the only radio was a crappy AM transistor on the other side of this warehouse, where there was kind of noise going on all the time. And I'd be working away, physical work, and I'd have to, listen when it got to the end of any tune. Are they going to play it next? And often days would go by without hearing it at all.
I remember this so vividly. And then
you'd invariably go out, for a cup of tea or whatever, and you come back in and it was halfway through.
Yeah.
And so you'd feel this combination of excitement and disappointment that you'd missed the beginning. So the point I want to make is my affection for Take It Easy by the Eagles, which is still burns quite brightly all these years later, is all down to the fact that I went days without being able to hear it. And it was not having access to it that my affection increased.
The only way you could have heard that is to buy a battery-operated record player and buy the record.
Oh, and then buying the record would not have been easy.
No, that wouldn't have been easy.
Yeah, if you're in West Side of Yorkshire in 1972, and this is by the Eagles, there wasn't in the charts at that point. You would have. That would have been a long shot to get that. You might have done, but, and then could you afford it? All that kind of stuff. Whereas anything now, you click, it's there, you hear it, you play it again, you play it again, you play it again.
And inevitably, halfway through it, you immediately think of something else and click on that. So
yeah, absolutely. It's, so it's a fundamentally different world of listening to music. And so are we surprised that we don't feel the same about it that we used to? We shouldn't be surprised at all.
Not remotely. There just should be much less of it. And it should be harder to find.
The Word Podcast, walking the digital dog since 2007.
We're joined by Alex Gold. How you doing, Alex? You all right?
I'm very well.
Good.
Very well.
We're thinking about revivals. I was thinking about revivals. Don't ask me why I was thinking about revivals, but I was. And I was wondering if we're still going to have in future musical revivals, because it struck me that musical revivals were a big part of kind of pop music history. And so,
Some very significant, weren't they?
Absolutely. Well, the first one I really remember, because I'm so old, is the kind of the trad jazz revival of the late 50s, early 60s. Kenny Ball and his jazz band, Chris Barber, all Agabill, all that sort of stuff was a very conscious effort to revive the old Dixieland jazz of the 20s and 30s, I suppose, in the face of what they saw as the kind of domination of dance bands and then bebop, I suppose. So the whole point about that music that those people played was that it was kind of swinging music you could dance to, and it was simple, and it was the old tunes, it was songs.
But also incredibly influential, wasn't it? Because it gave rock and roll something to kind of rebel against, wasn't it, and get rid of. And B, it started in the Ken Collier set. It started Donegan doing a skiffle act, and that produced the whole skiffle boom. And therefore, all those bands, the Beatles and the Stones and Led Zeppelin, were all in their little skiffle groups. So that was pretty significant, wasn't it?
So skiffle came from the trad jazz revival.
Yeah.
But then also, earlier than that, you had the kind of what they call in America the folk revival.
Yeah.
Which I suppose was the 1940s, isn't it? When people started getting together, people living in cities who have, never known any kind of rural family life, suddenly start gathering for square dances.
That's it, exactly.
And dressing up like farm workers and all that kind of thing, And it's out of that Bob Dylan and all that stuff.
Well, had Bob Dylan not, written all those political folk tunes at the time he was going up with Susie Rotolo, I'm not sure if rock music would have had that big political conscience that it eventually developed, And also, you could argue that the singer-songwriters, the Joni Mitchells and the Paul Simons and the James Taylors, all came out of that folk revival boom too.
Well, surely the Britpop thing in the 90s was essentially a 60s revival, wasn't it?
I suppose so.
It was really. It was Beatles, Kinks, wasn't it? Exactly. Yes,
the haircuts, the clothes, all that kind of stuff.
I personally, the haircuts,
can't wait for the noughties indie revival of 2042 when a bunch of 55-year-old blokes rapping and spangling stuff themselves into skinny jeans, t-shirt and tie combinations and trilbies. It's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. I cannot wait.
What will you be doing, Alex, when you're reviving? So what era are you talking about?
I'll tell you what I'll be doing. I'll be kidding myself that my skinny jeans still fit me.
You've got a long way to go to that, Alex. As I pointed out this morning, you still have to run about in the shower to get wet.
You can't walk. Don't dare walk across railings.
It's a proper first world problem.
Yeah.
So,
what about the mod revival?
Mod
revival, 78, 79. I mean,
except it continued for a long time, didn't it?
It also sort of happened in 1996, didn't it? Really, I mean, and it's kind of happening now in a little. I mean, there are still mod factions bopping about.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm involved in the Small Faces show, and that's
that's part of it. Yeah,
I experience the mod community on a weekly basis, so they're still there, and they're of all ages as well.
So you're involved in a group who kind of do the Small Faces or the Small Faces story, and so you'll do Tin Soldier, and I don't know what else you'll do. What you're going to do about it, all that stuff.
Do you want to hear about my experience last week? Actually,
go on. I do want to hear about it.
So we normally play theatres, but this particular gig was at a place called the Concord Club in Eastleigh, which was back in the day some kind of prominent jazz venue on the scene. So it's got a bit of historical pedigree, I suppose, but as of 2023, it's a little bit downtrodden. Sort of dinner venue. It's got a slight whiff of Phoenix Nights about it.
Right.
But anyway, so we get there, and I arrive about 3:00 in the afternoon, and in the room where we're meant to be playing later on, there's another event happening. It's what they call a ladies' Prosecco Afternoon. And
that's brilliant.
They are being entertained. They are being entertained by a very enthusiastic Robbie Williams impersonator.
Excellent.
I just want to feel. It's astonishing, absolutely brilliant. I bet he'd fathered so many children in that room.
Yeah.
He had all born with a little stripe in their eyebrow, like Pat Mustard from Father Ted.
So how was he presenting himself? Presumably not with a band.
No, he had backing tracks. Yeah, it was.
So what he arrived. It's a little bit like those scene you always get in a comedy where the strippogram arrives.
yeah.
Dressed as a policeman or whatever. Goes to arrest somebody.
In this case, it was a fat bloke dressed as Robbie Williams.
Was he being manhandled by the?
Definitely kind of Robbie Williams during his Fat Dancer from Take That sort of period.
Yeah.
There was sort of, and I saw the buckets of Prosecco being wheeled out afterwards when they were changing. 2 actual bins full of empty Prosecco. Those ladies went hard. My God, rock and roll is not dead. It is fully alive and well.
It's a new definition of rock and roll, isn't it? Yeah.
That's fantastic. But going back to the mod thing.
Yeah.
You were telling me when you appear doing the Small Faces stuff, the people who turn out, they're kind of elderly scooter owners, aren't they? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, in the nicest possible way, and I say this with love. We play to rooms full of gentlemen that look like thumbs. That's. I've appeared to have broke Dave there. That's the vibe, and it's fine. They love it, and it's great. It's great for us. We're appreciated. They like it. They're getting a little taste of.
But have they got scooters, or did they once have scooters?
So, what would happen?
Do any of them arrive on scooters?
Yeah. So, what would happen on the musical tour, for example? So, when we used to arrive in a new city for a clutch of dates, the local scooter club, and there's a scooter club in most big cities and towns, and in the UK, absolutely. They would do what's called a ride out. They'd all ride out in their parkers and on their scooters with all their lights and stuff en masse and meet us outside the theatre. Then we'd take a load of photos with them, and
these are blokes in their 50s.
Yeah, and they're all dressed to the nines, sharp suits.
What are they wearing? Suits and ties?
Suits, parkers over the top. The scooters are all decked out. It's all Jimmy from Quadrophenia scooters. And there'd be 20, 30, 40, 50 of them just kind of all riding out at the same time just to park outside the theatre for 15 minutes to take a few photos. It's spectacular.
See, this is what's interesting about them. We're talking about the mod revival. And it's more than a revival, isn't it? It's a whole strain of British enthusiasm that just continues, doesn't it? It probably never stopped since the early 60s, really.
I don't think it ever did, It's always going to be there. There's always going to be a corner of the UK that houses these people.
Yeah. And how much has to do with clothes? It's a lot, isn't it?
Oh, a lot.
Yes.
Clothes and scooters, actually.
Yeah, it is.
And the music probably a distant third.
I think they're the 3 pillars of it all. Really, I think they all prop each other up in their own way. The music's intrinsically linked with the clothes, for example. You can't have one without the other. You won't get a mod that's really into their clothes but not into their music.
So now the other thing that used to be the other revival feature that used to be a big feature of British life, I don't think is any longer, which is Teds, because Teddy Boys were, invented as they were supposed to ape the fashions adopted by dandies in the Edwardian era, weren't they? Yeah. And then they came to be associated with rock and roll. And that was a huge thing in the 60s and in the early 70s. But it's not anymore, is it? Do you see Teds any longer?
I never.
Never at all.
There was a minor kind of revival around the time of Malcolm McLaren, late 70s, wasn't the World's End, King's Road. You tend to see a few Teds, but I mean, I can just distantly remember being about 8 or 9. The kind of mods rockers wars on the South Coast, which are fantastic. Every bank holiday there'd be Teds versus mods, and that stuff was thrilling, I think. But no, I think that's disappeared completely.
And if so, that's an extraordinary thing that it's disappeared. I mean, you don't find yourself sitting opposite anybody on the tube who's decked out to look like Gene Vincent, do you? Any longer? I don't.
I think the key thing is, mod music in inverted commas, that's kind of evolved over the years. So with your Oasises and your Blurs and people like that, you did get a sort of, it wasn't strictly mod, but it was in that vein, whereas Ted's, it sort of evolved with the times is what I'm trying to say. And with rock and roll, which is intrinsically linked to Ted culture, rock and roll is kind of preserved in amber. That 12-bar progression is off its time, and there wasn't a 1990s version. There isn't a 2023 version. So
no, maybe not. Maybe not. Who's to say it won't happen at some point in the future?
Indeed.
What's the next thing that'll be revived?
I've no idea. Because
I always think there'll be a psychedelic revival, but those things only happen during prosperous times. It's good times that can allow for things like psychedelia, you know.
I know you could say, I mean, there's whole kind of scenes, isn't there, where people just love that kind of music and dress in those kind of clothes. That's sort of never gone away, really. But, you know, I don't think people have the same nostalgia because we all live with all this stuff all the time nowadays, don't we? And so we always say that young people with music, they hear all kinds of music, but they have no sense of chronology because they don't need to, because it's all just there permanently. You know, all those groups are there forever. So they don't hark back in quite the same way.
Yeah.
So it seems. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe right now somebody's reliving the heady days of 2012.
I'm telling you, that noughties indie revival, it's coming.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
Well, it's the 40th anniversary, I think, of Come On Island being number one on the Billboard chart.
My God, was it number one in America?
April 23rd, in 1983. Amazing. What a fantastic record. And it just made me think, you know, if you've ever been to a wedding reception or whatever and somebody puts on Come On Island, it is absolutely guaranteed to fill the floor.
Is it still?
I think so, yeah.
When's the most recent wedding you went to?
No, that's true. I haven't been to a wedding for 3 years, but it's certainly my niece's wedding. But I just thought that was an absolutely guaranteed. Do you think it's kind of out of date?
I don't know, Alex. You've probably been to weddings more recently.
The last wedding I went to was a punk rock wedding in Berlin, and they were playing "Too Drunk to Fuck" by the Dead Kennedys. And
was that what started the dancing? I'm talking about a multi-generational
other assorted classics. No, I think it is still played at weddings. That song is indelibly stamped on my memory. The first time I ever heard it, I don't know why I always remember this, but I was on holiday at a kind of holiday camp in Loo in Cornwall.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
And they stuck it on. I just remember the dance floor immediately filled up with loads of people dancing with their hands behind their backs.
Oh, really?
Okay.
I think it's aping a move from the video. They do it for like a 3-second period.
Yes, that's true, isn't it?
Oh, right, okay.
But I'll always remember that for some reason. And yeah, it's just, I still hear it. I still hear it in shops. I still hear it.
Do you think it's one of those tunes that if you play it at a wedding disco, do you think it's one of those things that blokes feel that they have permission to dance to?
Yeah, I do actually. I think there's something about the way that Kevin Rowland sings it. It just makes it feel like it's okay to do.
It's not soppy.
No, exactly.
It's not, though, is it?
Also, anybody can sing along with Kevin Rowland and not feel they're being upstaged.
Yeah.
Not exactly the classic singer, is he?
No.
But there are just certain songs that work. I think "Hey Ya" is another one.
Oh,
I think "Crazy
classic.
in Love" by Beyonce is another.
Yeah.
one.
Crazy in Love, undoubtedly.
It's phenomenal record. You stick that on, absolutely anybody of any age will think that's okay. Let's Twist Again. Twisting
Mr.
the Night Away.
Brightside.
You're always back for Let's Twist Again, don't you,
Yeah.
Mark?
Dancing Queen. You can't go wrong.
Dancing Queen, you simply can't go wrong. I'm a great believer in Van Halen's Jump.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's got that bloke thing, you know, that bloke sees all right now, you know, you can come out, you know.
Your theory is you have to put records on that get girls dancing. Once the girls are dancing, the boys will dance.
Yeah, the boys just got to get pissed enough. I mean, the truth is the boys want to dance as early as the girls do dance.
But they're just too self-conscious.
The guys don't dare. But I can't remember who I was talking to about this the other day. Okay, Alex, all right, I'm going to try this on Alex. It's a live experiment.
Go on.
On a younger person. Have you ever, Alex, during your checkered and colourful dating career. Have you ever crossed the floor of what could be called the dance floor, either in a dance hall or in a club or in a scout hut? Have you ever nervously crossed the floor towards a girl to whom you have never previously spoken and then asked her if she'd like to dance? Have you ever done that?
I have. I've gone one better, actually. Yeah. Oh gosh. So I was in Florida with the ukulele orchestra, and I'd made a plan to meet some of the guys at a club down the road for a couple of drinks. We had a day off, and I think I'd been out that day, and so I was already a little bit merry. And I walk into the club, and there's a girl dancing in the club. I was in my leather jacket and my skinny jeans with my snakeskin boots with a chain on, long hair. I was looking pretty.
What a vision!
Pretty weird that day. It was good. And this girl just beckoned me over, and we just went straight in for a big hearty snog. It was great, and then we started dancing. And then after the song, we went our separate ways.
Alex, that is exciting story. That is.
That's astonishing.
I've been thinking about it for weeks. That is not the same. That is the polar opposite of going up to a girl and saying, "Would you like to dance?" That's a girl pretty much inviting you to sexual congress. That couldn't be further away from the thing.
No, we did do dancing though. We did dance.
Okay, well, you didn't ask her though, did you?
Well, in a way.
No. You see, okay, sorry.
That's the thing that we went through when we were
school
kids.
Discos.
It was terrifying, wasn't it, Dave?
So you did that at school? You did
school discos. The boys would be at one side of the hall, the girls would be the other, all sort of shuffling their feet, looking really nervous, and one would be the seal breaker. Like eventually there'd be one guy or one girl who'd sort of venture across and ask someone to dance, and then it was okay.
So asking someone to dance is as old as human history. Okay, it goes back. Jane Austen goes back. Tudor times, before that, and so forth. It's a long tradition. And then it disappeared about 30 years ago. It disappeared with clubbing. Because with clubbing, from what I can gather, people go out in groups. They go out in groups.
And you might find yourself somehow, through a bit of manoeuvring, dancing with somebody.
Absolutely.
But otherwise, you're not actually saying it's you and me.
No.
And if one of them wants to stop, it stops.
Because if you go across, if you went across the dance hall of the Mecca Ballroom in Wakefield in 1965 and approached, Angela Noble to pick.
He's listening too. Hello, Angela.
Pick a name out of nowhere.
Yeah.
You weren't just saying, "Would you like to dance with me?" You were saying, "I fancy you," weren't you?
Absolutely.
Were you?
Totally.
Which. And that was the kind of 60s equivalent of asking somebody's father if you could pay his daughter attentions, wasn't it? You know what I mean? It was kind of formal, wasn't it?
Which is why it was so mortifying if they said, "No, I don't want to dance."
Oh, good God!
And even there was no excuse. They would just go, "No, I'd much rather just stay here." Not even talking to anybody. Actually, on my own. I'd rather be on my own, just sitting here with this cigarette and this glass of baby sham than I would be dancing with you. I know. It hurts. Still hurts.
It still hurts. Well, if you've had experiences of, of that or being rejected, even better. We want to hear them, don't we, Alex? We want to hear them.
We do.
Yes, come on down. Share your pain with us.
The Word Podcast. What's wrong with being sexy?
And it's time to celebrate the birthday of one of our valued Patreon supporters, Andrew Newbury. Andrew, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
Have you had the birthday?
Yeah, it was nearly 4 weeks ago now. We were in Napa Valley.
Oh, very good.
Enjoying the finest wines available to humanity.
Absolutely. What are they called? That film, Sideways. Is it Sideways?
Yeah. It's filmed.
Which I must go and see again. Yeah, it's a really good film.
We rewatched it a few weeks ago, just before we went away. It's one of those films that's there's more angst in it that you remember, actually. It's quite a dark film.
I'm sure. But here's the truth. All the films that used to be funny are now slightly dark. because morality has so kind of changed. I was talking to Mark. I watched Manhattan the other day. And you can't watch Manhattan without going, oh, God.
I know, yeah. These days you think, yes. And actually, it's too close to the bone, isn't it?
So anyway, you've got a log you wanted to throw on the fire.
I do indeed. Yeah, my theory about the Beatles is that...
Oh, we always like a theory.
We like a Beatles theory. We can work it out. Is the fulcrum, maybe the tipping point of Beatles songs. And I think it's more about Lennon and McCartney rather than the Beatles generally, and whether it's the song that really signalled the shift of Paul taking control of the Beatles away from John Lennon. You know, because there was a double A side, and it was We Can Work It Out was the one that really got the airplay, so essentially became the A side of the song.
But also very unusual in that it's one of the rare examples of one where they each do sections of lead vocal, don't they?
Yeah.
Isn't Paul McCartney the lead vocalist, and John Lennon sings the bridge, one of the best middle eights they ever wrote.
It's great. And the thing is, people talk about John being the darker of the two, and actually his middle eight is quite a positive message, whereas the main melody of the song, Paul's bit, I think is actually quite sort of I was going to say cantankerous, but it's quite a dogmatic approach. We can work it out if you agree with me, if you're on my side. It's actually not as positive a message as you think, I think, whereas John's bit is.
See, that we're talking suspicious coercive behaviour, wouldn't it? Actually bullying.
I can remember hearing that record on the radio when it was first played. I was sitting there having tea at home with my mother and my sister, and they played both sides, and I could hear it still. And it was the brilliant thing about that record, as of so many of those great Beatles records, it was a combination of the familiar and the unfamiliar. You thought, this is fresh, it's catchy, but it's also slightly strange. And it's
what jumped out? Was it the harmonium?
Absolutely.
And it's all the things like it starts right at the beginning. Try to see it my way. It's off, you know. It doesn't get you ready for anything at all.
Yeah, there's no introduction.
It just pitches you in. It's incredibly fresh, and it's one of my favourite Beatles records. Still, I mean, I think you're right about a fulcrum point between the kind of mop tops and the kind of psychedelic adventurers, if you like. The other thing that's odd that Mark and I were talking about earlier the other week is how rude Day Tripper is as a song.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Nobody revolted.
In fact, I think To Ride's pretty rude too, actually, but we just didn't realise it at the time. But Day Tripper, my God, extraordinary.
But nobody would have thought about it at the time, I suppose, on the fact it's on daytime radio.
No, you didn't. People are a lot less dirty-minded than they are nowadays.
Yeah.
That's the curious thing. Everybody's really careful about what they say nowadays because they're very aware of all the ramifications.
It's hiding in plain sight, isn't it? It's one of those.
Yeah. Well, look, nice to talk to you.
You too.
And
just one little thing in terms of a record to recommend to you.
Go on.
This is something I don't know if you've heard. Is this?
Right, okay. Is this new?
Yeah, it's actually a new release. Came out about 2 years ago, but it's sort of jazz from the 60s and 70s.
Right.
Some odd things, some well-known people like John Dankworth, Stan Tracy, but loads of obscure stuff. And if you want a bit of groovy 60s London, it's a really nice place to start. Yeah,
Journeys in Modern Jazz, Britain. Is that the one?
Yeah. Really recommend it, because I know, Dave, you've been listening to it quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it's good old compilation.
Very nice.
Very good. I shall look that up.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.